What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Altcentrism Central podcast. Today, it's our normal hosts. We've got me and we've got Peyton, and we have a special guest here today. His name is TJ. He's from Kentucky, and he will be explaining his situation right now. He's involved with a lot of lawsuits and just some generally really interesting stuff. So, without further ado, TJ, could you please introduce yourself?
So my name's TJ Roberts. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I was involved with Students for RAND in 2016. I was involved with Savannah Maddox for State House in 2018. Now I find myself thrown into a generally pro-liberty state that has some of the most stringent shutdown regulations in the entire country. So much so that I received a 2-week quarantine notice for simply doing something that I have been doing since I was 13 years old, and that is going to church. I received a 2-week quarantine order for going to an in-person service on Easter Sunday, in spite of the fact that quite literally no other places had ever received a quarantine notice like that. So my decision was to sue the governor. This lawsuit was pertinent to both the travel ban and the church ban that the governor had imposed. And the Sixth Circuit, which is a federal circuit just one step removed from the Supreme Court, ruled unanimously that that was unconstitutional. Later on, I wound up suing the governor again on a case that stated that the governor's mass gathering ban fundamentally violated the right to protest. And we won that as well. And just to be clear, my attorney is not done suing the governor for his brazenly unconstitutional shutdown of our society.
So how many lawsuits have you won so far?
So far, I've won 2 lawsuits, and those 2 lawsuits have struck down 3 of Beshear's most onerous rules that he has established in our state.
Oh, that's incredible. What's the one that's ongoing right now? What's that one about?
The one that's ongoing, actually, there isn't one that's ongoing right now. I can't really talk about the details of it, but I will say that Beshear's not done getting sued by my attorney, in the context that we will be filing more lawsuits. Particularly, we can just see just a couple of issues that are coming down, which I think we could talk about a little bit more into the interview. I don't want to give any hints as to what we're suing about.
Okay. And just to be clear, are you suing the governor personally, or are you suing the state?
I'm suing the governor in his official capacity.
Okay, gotcha.
It's not a personal thing, but the fact of the matter is that he's definitely taking it personally. Most people would be proud of this. I'm proud of this. You can tell based upon recent interviews that myself and my attorney are definitely getting under Beshear's skin, where he calls the Sixth Circuit, which is a federal court that's one step removed from the Supreme Court, calls them liars. He calls me and my attorney a liar. I mean, he is taking this very personally, in the fact that petty tyrants, frankly, don't like getting challenged, and they especially don't like losing when they get challenged.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. So I don't know that much about this Governor Beshear. Could you give us a little bit of your insight into his person, his character, the way he governs, and just generally the history of things that have been happening in Kentucky leading up to this?
Yeah, absolutely. So Kentucky was quite lucky in the context that from 2015 through 2019, they had a governor by the name of Matt Bevin. He wasn't perfect. He had his issues. He was a little rough on the edges. But just to talk about some of the things that Kentucky got done under Matt Bevin. Right to work was passed and signed by the governor. This was a bill that made to where unions cannot force you to join their collective, which you would think that the First Amendment would make that very clear, that you don't have a right to force someone to associate with you. So we passed that into law. We repealed the prevailing wage, which made it to where public works are set to the market value instead of the value that a union arbitrarily sets as the value of their labor. In addition to this, we slashed regulations. We overall decreased spending. all the while fully funding teachers' pensions. Just hold on to that because that is important. One of the bigger accomplishments was done in Governor Bevin's final term, and also the only year in which Savannah Maddox was also a state representative under Governor Bevin's term. Savannah Maddox introduced two bills that gained a lot of traction and were both successfully passed and signed by the governor without amendment. And those bills were constitutional carry, which makes it to where you no longer have to ask permission to carry a concealed firearm, and the Campus Free Speech Act, which was a bill that essentially states that public universities within the state of Kentucky must respect the First Amendment in the fullest capacity. This banned free speech zones, this banned content-based discrimination, everything along these lines. These are all things that were done under this governor's term. But even though he had fully funded the teachers' pensions, making it to where public education was more than half of all the state spending, the teachers' unions drug him through the mud. It was to the point that he wound up losing by around 5,000 votes in the 2019 governor's election against Andy Beshear. Beshear simply ran on a platform of, I am not Matt Bevin. And that was enough to get him elected, not because of the policies that I spoke about beforehand, but rather it was more of a personal thing. Governor Bevin, as I stated, was very rough around the edges. Beshear was literally just, I don't mean this in a degrading way, but like, he was a dork. He was a nice guy. Like, he just was there to say, like, Matt Bevin is a bully, and I'm here to throw this bully out of office, that type of stuff.
Okay, all right, I see.
And he didn't really let on about what his policies were. But if you look into who donated to him, all of this makes sense. The number one provider of his campaigns, it wasn't small dollars, it was major businesses, it was Planned Parenthood, it was NARAL, it was public sector unions. So that was the big backbone of his campaign. So it makes sense that while churches were not able to operate, abortion clinics were still open in Kentucky. It makes sense why mom and pop shops that overwhelmingly give to Republicans and overwhelmingly serve counties that have Republican voter bases, Walmart, Target, Meijer, Kroger, other big companies were able to stay open as well. It makes sense why, when we look into it, the things that are being restricted are the things that did not donate to Governor Beshear.
Wow. So yeah.
He was he was a new governor, and we didn't really get to see how he is as a governor until this thing had happened. And it's showing very clearly that the nice guy may just so happen to be easily the most authoritarian person.
I think it's incredible that you guys managed to get free speech on college campuses, just as a quick side note there. So the situation in Kentucky right now is that small businesses are closed. You can't go to churches, things like that. But all of these big companies, like it is in New York, for example, Walmart can stay open because they have like a grocery store or whatever, but they can still shop all around the store, right? So all of these big companies are open, but all of these smaller institutions are all closed. And that's how things are in Kentucky right now, right?
Not so much anymore. Due to my lawsuits, the reopening has had to happen much quicker.
Okay.
You look into, Beshear was forced to reopen churches early. He was forced to pretty much speed up everything because he realized that he was going to get sued even more and lose even more if he didn't. For example, Beshear stated that no bars will be open until June 29th. But my first day back in Kentucky, for a while, I went to 2 bar and grills in that one day. So let's just say that they're getting reopened a lot quicker than it otherwise would have. So that's one of the things with it, is that these lawsuits are having actionable results, not only with the right to worship, the right to travel, and the right to protest. It's lighting a fire under Beshear's feet. Understand that if he keeps this going, he's going to get sued by even larger margins. And there's a court case up in Ohio that shows that while I'm not a lawyer, I know that precedent does apply. It comes down to the fact that because he forcefully shut down these institutions, they're now entitled to Fifth Amendment takings compensation, which that in itself could bankrupt the state.
I was not aware of that. That's interesting. So I want to ask you quickly, have there been any negatives to these lawsuits? Have there been, say, people attacking you or anything like that? What about the government? The government must certainly hate you now, right?
Oh God, yes. I mean, I've made my enemies in the government anyway. I will say before then, most of the enemies were establishment Republicans who didn't like that I was forcing them to vote on actually conservative bills. But oh well. Another thing that we accomplished in 2019 was we got the heartbeat bill passed and signed as well. But the thing is that the people who really despise me are, it's not so much Beshear, it's his mob. I would say that the people that follow him to the letter and take his word as gospel are far more dangerous than him. The fact of the matter is that if Beshear didn't have the backing of KSP and he didn't have the backing of the public union, and he didn't have the backing of this literal mob of people, he would just be some loser with bad ideas. The fact of the matter is that I've received upwards of 1,000 death threats. One of them was actually actionable, where this guy threatened to, quote, shoot me in the streets and use my corpse as a table. He proceeded to send me my address, pictures of my family members, things along those lines. So that's just some of the things with it, is that, yeah, it was hard. I had people that I went to middle or high school with send out threats against me. I had them issue statements. I had quote unquote family members. I had a former stepmom of mine go after me pretty hot and heavy, which, oh well, that happens. You know, I mean, the fact of the matter is that whenever you're fighting for something as important as the fundamental rights that are God-given to you, every single one of those betrayals, every single one of those people who turned their back on me, it was worth it. Every single one of them.
Okay. Well, that's unfortunate. I'm sorry that you had to have that much that many drawbacks to this, but I mean, you got what you wanted to have happen in the end, right? You know, so, and you're still suing. You're still making a third lawsuit. So, hey, man.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the thing, is that there are things that are going to be coming up very quickly. But like, the fact of the matter is that it wasn't much of a loss. It didn't really hurt me all that bad to see this happening, because if anything, it vindicated me. It made me realize that these guys realize that I'm right, so they don't have to try to sit down and be a voice of reason, because they realize that the voice of reason is on my side. So they chose to threaten and intimidate me. And quite frankly, it showed who the true friends were. Because whenever I launched a lawsuit, no one really knew how that was going to go. No one really knew that. And because of that, the people that are with me when it's popular to be with me, they very quickly turn their backs on me. Frankly, I'm glad they did.
Let me ask you this. This is a question you probably have not heard before, just something that I'm personally interested in. So for the people who turn their backs on you, did you notice that anybody in your circle who may have disagreed with you, but, didn't, turn their backs on you and cut you out of their lives or anything? Or was there none of that whatsoever?
Yes, actually there are. I have a pretty good number of people that are not only adults by the law, but they are adults by action, who fundamentally disagree with me, and they still stand by me as a human being. And quite frankly, I appreciate those guys about as much as I appreciate the people who agree with me, honestly. The fact that they're willing to take our disagreements and act and just live with those disagreements, it's something else to me.
Well, that makes me really glad to hear. I'm glad that, polarization is not at the point where it's an impossibility to fix that now. So that's very good. All right, Peyton has some questions for you.
Sure.
Yeah, so first I wanted to ask you is there's a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of people who went after you, what they were worried about, uh, at least what they claim to be worried about, is, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we have a virus going on, isn't it irresponsible to even go to church or go to mass gatherings? Why stand up? Why stand up and sue the governor over this? You know, isn't this just counterproductive to what we need to do to fight the virus?
Not at all. And that's one of the things that people have turned it into such a false dichotomy of we have to either fight the virus and completely abandon the Constitution, or we keep the Constitution and everyone dies of the virus. That's not, those two are not different. Those two are not the only options. The fact of the matter is that at the beginning, there were very reasonable restrictions that Bashir did place. He closed schools from public access, which had made it to where, and the reason why that was a very good idea is because we have a large percentage of children in Kentucky who are raised by their grandparents who, by the fact of their age, are at risk of contracting and dying from this virus. That makes sense. That's a good idea to do this. There were other things that were done as well, right? Where and that's completely within our constitutional realm. As a matter of fact, you look into the Kentucky state or the federal constitution, it's very clear that emergencies do give expanded powers. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't allow for the governors or the federal government to fundamentally restrict our liberties, right? For example, one of the things that they could have done is they could have delegated funds for the sake of national defense into a PR campaign encouraging people to stay home, encouraging people to wear a mask, encouraging people to make sure that they're doing contact-free business, things along those lines. Those are things that they could have done, but instead the government chose to use force on this, which demonstrates to them that, to me, that they may have known that it wasn't a serious problem. And especially going into my main thing, the big one that I did was the church case. The one thing that I take more seriously than my political philosophy or how other people see me, for example, because a lot of people are like, "Oh, your future's done." Well, I really don't care if my future in civil society is done, because the thing that I put above all of that is worshiping and empowering the power of my God. That's the thing that I put forward of everything else. The fact of the matter is that there is inherent risk, but the most beautiful thing about Christianity, in my opinion, is that you become a Christian through a free choice. No one forces you to accept God into your life. And you look into the Bible, it states very clearly the beautiful thing about it is that it is your call. There'd be no meaning to worshiping God if humans were naturally wired to do that. Rather, the beautiful part about it is that we choose to do that in spite of everything else. And for people who will reference Romans 13, you can just simply look into the book of Acts with 5:29, which states that we must obey God before man. So as far as I'm concerned, this whole thing of like, well, there's a virus and this is all counterproductive to fight the virus. For one, I was more safe at the church service than I was whenever I was going to Walmart every day just to get basic exposure with other people.
So yeah, I mean, what is it like being at church versus being say at Walmart or a grocery store? Are there certain protocols in place to keep people safe, or can I ask you this? I guess, what was Bashir's reasoning to closing down churches instead of keeping them open like he kept some of the other things open?
Honestly, I think it was him just targeting political foes. Particularly the church that I went to on Easter Sunday, Maryville Baptist Church. They've been engaged in pro-life efforts throughout this entire time. And you just follow the money. NARAL and Planned Parenthood were major donors to Bashir's campaign. Mm-hmm. So he figured that he would shut down churches in order to stop those efforts from happening. In addition, there is one instance in which a church revival led to an outbreak of the virus. But that is one isolated incident that was before we were aware that the virus was even in Kentucky. We also look at this as well. These guys weren't practicing social distancing in the context of they didn't have a 6-foot distance between each congregant. They didn't have hand sanitizer in each pew. All of those things were things that were done at my church. At my church, they had hand sanitizer in each seat. They had areas where they requested that people sat. There was easy availability in order for you to get away from people if you didn't want to be within their close proximity. So with that in mind, like,
it sounds very reasonable. Sounds like very reasonable accommodations to keep people safe.
Right, and that's the entire thing, is that none of those accommodations are at Walmart. None of those accommodations are at Lowe's. None of those accommodations are at any of these major corporations that have been deemed essential, and therefore, by the power invested in their lobbyists, they're all of a sudden immune from the virus.
So are things slowly returning to normal in Kentucky, or what stage are you at in terms of reopening, and what would you like to do going forward?
So we're in what I would call it stage 1.5. You can go to a bar and restaurant. You can get a haircut. There's a lot of restrictions attached to it. You can go to church. You can go to a congregation of like 10 people or less. Some retailers are reopening. So ultimately things are starting to reopen. However, there's still a lot of problems ahead of us. If a bar doesn't serve food, for example, I don't think they can reopen. Pools cannot reopen. The restrictions that Beshear has placed upon youth sports is downright brutal, to the point that there's really no point in even engaging in youth sports. In addition to it, you have an election, you have a primary election, which people like us that believe in liberty have a very big vested interest in this election going well, because Thomas Massie has a primary opponent this year. But this election is perhaps one of the most onerous restrictions that we have now, to where Beshear's trying to make it to where it's all mail-in voting, which if we have an all mail-in voting system, that in itself is the end of the republic. But the fact is that we still have the option to, quote, vote in person, but in order to vote in person, whereas, say, in my home county, where there's more than 100 polling places, there's only one polling place in my home county. It's the same way for Jefferson County, which contains Louisville, which has a population of 760,000 people. This whole idea that we're trying to stop the spread of the virus is absolutely nonsense. They're not trying to do that. They're trying to suppress voter turnout from rural areas, because they're sticking these polling places in the most urban place that they could find in order to increase voter turnout there and decrease voter turnout from people who have to drive for an hour in order to get to where they want to be.
Okay. So, can I ask you, what's the problem with voting by mail? And I'm a little bit confused, because you said that they're placing voting centers in, say, cities, but if people are voting by mail, then why is that a problem for people in rural areas?
Sure, and the reason why it's a problem is when we look at mail-in voting, it's rife with fraud. It is simply, at that point, your elections become not the voice of the people, but the voice of the people that the USPS gets to. It's also a matter of who is watching the Watchmen at that point. At least with in-person voting, there is a very clear paper trail, whereas with mail-in voting, there are additional arbitrary rules attached to it. There's no guarantee that the person filling out the ballot is the person that was named on the ballot as well. We can see voter fraud in West Virginia this past primary as well, in which a member of the USPS has been charged with attempting to defraud the public of a fair election, in which he altered the ballot. He altered hundreds of ballots. We have no idea if people have had elections that were closed because of those margins. That we can look even at Operation Win at the Door, in which we have had victories by fewer than 10 votes. So there's fundamental issues with mail-in voting whenever there's just such a lack of ability for people to mobilize in the proper way that we know of. There's also less of an accountability mechanism with mail-in voting. So ultimately, we're just leaving behind the people who are already being left behind in this state.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes more sense now. I get it now. Peyton, do you have anything else? Because I think I have like one more question for TJ, but after that, I'm pretty good. You there, Peyton?
His mic is off, I think.
Yeah, I'm here. So, a question I had for you was specifically, it's about why is it specifically that we should have opposed these lockdowns, and what did Bashir do wrong that he could have done differently besides what you've already mentioned? I mean, while Kentucky is not the most affected state, it could have been, say, if you had a situation like in New York. So what realistically could have been done? Because not everyone's going to just follow the rules just because a PR campaign said so.
The thing is that what is the role of government? The role of government is to protect your rights. It's to protect your right to your life, property, and liberty. Right? The goal of government isn't to make you make good decisions. Right? The goal of the government isn't to come in and say, hey, I noticed that you're majoring in philosophy or political science, but you could be making so much more money if you're doing engineering. So why don't we just change you over to engineering, for example? Right? There's that as well. So we look at the shutdown. Really, the thing that he could have done differently was just let us choose. Kentucky, at the fundamental level, isn't New York, right? We have two major metropolitan areas, that's Lexington and Louisville. That accounts for about 1 million of the people in the state. Everyone else lives in either suburban or rural counties. There are some quasi-urban places such as Covington and Newport, but even there, it's not nowhere near as packed as, say, New York or New Jersey. So we're so fundamentally different. We should have been at this point to where we're just realizing that it really is in our own hands about what is the right decision to make. And that's one of the biggest things with it, is that, quite frankly, I would be far more okay with these restrictions if private industries had decided to impose it upon themselves to say, we're going to stay closed because we just think that it's not in our best interest. But that's not what was done here. This was done by the strong arm of the government that fundamentally violates the basic rights of individuals, that threw the Constitution out the window. And we can even see this within the court system. Bashir, it's not a coincidence that Bashir is getting his butt handed to him in the federal court systems. So that's my whole take on, is that, yeah, not everyone's going to make the right decision. Sure, more people are going to get the virus. But when we look at it with what the CDC has recently done, with estimating that the death toll of this virus is only 0.26% of the people that get infected, quite frankly, it may have been a good idea to let the virus spread at least a little bit in order to make sure that we have herd immunity. But now that we've gone in, we've made it to where people have been staying inside, isolating from the rest of humanity. We've shattered their immune systems because they're not within civil society. Right? I would say that the fact that I've overwhelmingly ignored these rules has helped me, if anything, to the point that I've been around enough people to where I feel as though my immune system is probably far stronger than the rest of the people. So honestly, the thing that he should have done differently is he should have stayed out of our lives. He should have let us choose. Let's just look at this. Kentucky isn't the most heavily hit with the virus, but we are the most heavily hit economically. We have the worst unemployment rate in the country right now. If you take a room of 10 people who had a job before the crisis, 4 of them will not have a job now in Kentucky. That's how bad that it's gotten. We have a fundamental inability to feed our families here, and we see that it's getting even worse with food shortages, which is why we need to pass the PRIME Act. So ultimately, the thing that he should have done differently is he should have, if anything, expanded freedom.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, a lot of that makes a lot of that makes sense, and I totally hear what you're saying. Um, but I just want to say I don't think the thing that you said about immune systems is quite accurate. I think your immune system is just about the same as everybody else's right now. Um, but otherwise, yeah, I totally get you.
It's one of those things to where you can just, if you want, I can send you some research on to where interaction with other human beings helps strengthen your general immunity, whereas isolation can make it much weaker to where you go into a social setting that you're not used to, then you wind up with sicknesses. You'll see that, for example, there are studies that show that people who tend to keep to themselves after going to music festivals are far more likely to get sick compared to people who wind up in social settings quite frequently.
Okay, well, I can't refute that because I mean I haven't seen your sources obviously, but after this, you know, I'd be really interested to see what you got about that as an EMT student. I think that'd be really interesting to read about.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so I have a question considering based off of like what you've said, to me it kind of seems like what at least you believe and possibly is what the truth is that Bashir's motivation for these lockdowns has not been for general safety. Would you say that it's more of a political motivation? And if it is a political motivation, what is there to gain politically from doing this?
I would say that it is overwhelmingly political in the context of people still operate on their base instincts. You look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People particularly focus on safety and security. Bashir's not looking at the higher things of it, right? So you coordinate a campaign in which you make it to where a virus that has a less than 0.5% chance of killing you, but you make it out to be an apocalypse-inducing virus. Then from there, you state that you are going to be the one to get everyone through this. From there, it creates a savior complex to where even when you look at what recent polling shows is that a majority of Republicans, up until about a month and a half ago, a majority of Republicans supported Bashir throughout this whole thing. So it's one of those things to where by going down to the base level of saying, I'm going to keep you safe, I'm going to keep you secure, I'm not like all those things, that basic level makes it to where the governors become sort of a nurturing figure in your life rather than the person dealing with the political matters in your life. And it really did boost his popularity. His popularity was as high as 80% in the state of Kentucky. That's an approval rating that rivaled President Trump's approval rating in a state that voted for Trump by about that margin as well.
Okay, so you would, so just so I get this clear, after he has implemented the lockdowns, there has been an increase in his approval rating or a decrease?
An extreme increase.
Okay.
When you look at the voter total, less than half of Kentuckians voted for him. The third party sucked off enough votes to the point that Bashir got less than a majority. The fact of the matter is he would not be anywhere near as popular as he currently is if it weren't for this. Because you look at Kentucky, it's overwhelmingly pro-gun, overwhelmingly pro-life, it's pretty pro-conservative liberty type fusion there until a virus hits. At which point they don't care about guns, they don't care about abortion, they literally just cared about what is Bashir saying in his daily live streams.
Yeah, okay. So I mentioned this before we were actually recording the podcast, but something kind of similar is happening in New York, where New York, Andrew Cuomo may have won re-election, but he basically only won in New York City. The rest of the state voted for either his Republican opponent or loaded for the third party candidate Larry Sharp. And, you know, now, ever since he's done the lockdowns, his approval rating, even among Republicans where it was extremely low, has increased. So would you say like these lockdowns in general are being used as a, tool for politics in general?
Uh, yes, I mean fundamentally, like just to put it in this way, I'm not the biggest fan of President Trump. I like to see myself as a referee. When he does a good thing, I give him praise. When he does a bad thing, I condemn it. But the fact of the matter is that that's not what these governors are. When you look at where these shutdowns have been lifted, the shutdowns have been lifted in Republican states, and the shutdowns have remained in place in Democratic states. And the Democratic governors, they're not stupid. They're very well aware that keeping this lockdown in place for so long will destroy the economy, which will make it to where people will ultimately blame the president because the president is at the top of the political sphere. That's the fact of the matter with it. They're trying to compromise the president at this point, and frankly, I get that political strategy. I just think that it's absolutely disgusting that they're willing to politicize the pandemic in order to achieve their political ends.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I have to agree that it definitely seems like there's a political angle to it. Based on what you've described and based off of what I personally know about it, there's definitely a political angle there.
It's not really surprising to me, though. I mean, people politicize everything now. It's not just the politicians. It's, identity politics. Everything is politicized, so it doesn't really surprise me.
Yeah. I go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say it is not surprising, but it is disappointing, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, it's extremely disappointing. I mean, that's the whole thing. Is like this. You would think this would be a time in which people could come together in order to state, we're going to try to ride the wave of this virus while also not destroying the economy. Because we have to understand, and that's another thing that just I think of, is that people nowadays have lost their ability to do cost-benefit analysis. The masses who watch the media, which Maj Toure very wisely described as, quote, the most efficient devil in America, these guys at the fundamental level don't think about what the costs are of locking down society, because we have to drop everything to make sure that this virus is handled. And originally it was just, you have Anthony Fauci saying 15 days to flatten the curve. Well, that was plus long days ago. I mean, that's the things that people are fundamentally so tunnel vision that they can't look into seeing what else is going on in our society. What are we losing out on? I mean, the major cities of this country is currently on fire because there are riots over the fact that a police officer murdered a man in broad daylight. But the fact is that people are more focused on this virus than focused on what do we have to do in order to end these riots.
Yeah, I have to agree that that's definitely the case. The political tint to it seems quite apparent. But what do you think about the virus itself? Do you think the virus is overhyped? A lot of people who are like against the lockdowns also, come out and criticize the actual threat of the virus. And I don't want to say necessarily diminish it, but think it's been overblown. Would you put yourself in that camp?
Sort of. The virus is real. It has the very real ability to kill people. As someone who is asthmatic, it's something that I do take into consideration. I try to stay 6 feet apart from people mostly. But the fact of the matter is that when we look into it, you look at the original models as they were existing, they were showing that even with these shutdowns, we were still going to get millions of cases in America and hundreds of thousands of deaths. Well, 3 months later, it's nowhere near as bad as originally projected. The death rate is nowhere as high as originally predicted, to where we were looking at Italy's models, but then when we look at what our models are showing, especially with what degree that we look at in terms of how many cases we project to be asymptomatic, the CDC itself admits that the death rate is around 0.26%. A lot of the people who died from this virus would have also died from other viruses. I'm not saying that this thing is like the flu. It's definitely much more severe than the flu in terms of its symptoms. But the fact of the matter is that the question is, at what point, what's the line that we draw in which we're willing to give up our fundamental liberties? For me, this virus doesn't cross that line.
Well, that's interesting. At what point would you give up your fundamental liberties if you're saying there is a line?
See, I don't believe in the line. I understand that there are some lines that people do in fact have, but a virus that kills about 0.25% of the people, that's not that doesn't seem like a rational line, right? And that's the big thing with it, in which we look at our rights. We look into our founding documents. These rights are fundamentally inalienable, right? It's not a matter of whether or not the death toll is 1%, 5%, so on and so forth, right? The fact is that even in the worst of emergencies, you still have your fundamental rights. I mean, that's the whole thing when we look at it for, there's this one meme that's out there that I actually really appreciate that just says, how many people have to die before you will give up your gun? So my answer is one, me. I have to die before I'll give that up. Because the fact is, those rights, those liberties that this country has fought for in so many ways, those rights don't come from the government. It doesn't even come from us. We didn't all just come together. It's innate in our very nature that we have these rights because it's of the indisputable fact that you own yourself. Does that mean that you should go out and do everything that you otherwise would do? Maybe not. That's your call to make, though. That's the whole thing, is that I'm just an advocate of letting people choose.
Fair enough. I totally get that. I just wanted to play devil's advocate and ask, where the line might be if you did have a line.
Sure.
Yeah, but what would you say to people who say that, your rights end where mine began? Some people are, worried that if we open up, people who are going to be at risk at this virus are going to be affected and hurt by this. What would you say to these people who are worried about that?
If you are worried, or someone who is worried about this virus, it is your call and it is their call as to whether you and them stay inside. At the foundational level, I don't have the right to tell you how to live your life. You also don't have the right to tell me how to live mine. That isn't to say that your life is unimportant, but it is to say that my rights are just as important as your rights. Just because you have the right to go out into public doesn't mean that you're free from the risks of going out in public. The moment I step outside of my house, there's some pretty nasty clouds going on there. There's a pretty low risk, the risk is still there, that I'll be struck by lightning, right? I'm not absolved of the risks out there that currently exist. In the same way that people who go out into civilization don't all of a sudden wash away the risk of getting a virus. Now, I will say, people who know they have the virus, who are not refusing to stay indoors in order to stop the spread of this thing, I get that. Those guys, yeah, you should probably stay inside. And quite frankly, there is a good case to be made that maybe that maybe we should force you to stay inside if you have tested positive and we know that you're a carrier of this virus. But the fact of the matter is, you still have to you have to understand that even before this pandemic, there were risks associated with it. I could go on a drive right now, and there's a very real chance that I'll wind up crashing my car. Whether it'll be my fault or not, who knows, right? This whole statement that people state of like, well, I have a right to go out in public safety safely. Well, kind of, right? You have the right to go out in public, but so do I. Right? Why is it that your rights are all of a sudden more important? Because they say that my rights end where your rights begin. But what's the only way that you can get this virus? It's if you go outside as well, if you go out into public, right? I'm not going to stop you from staying inside, sheltering in place until this whole thing is over and you feel comfortable doing it. Just don't stop me from going outside until you're comfortable with me going out.
Yeah, I see. It's kind of like saying that it's guilty until proven innocent. Everybody has it until, you're proven that you don't have it. And that's what a lot of, and I've heard a lot of the elites and the politicians talking about plans for reopening, like, well, you have to have a vaccine passport, for example, or something like that. But so what you're saying is, no, that's bullshit. We should just be able to do what we want as long as we're not hurting people.
Right. And I mean, you look at this whole standard of, oh, we have to get a vaccine going. If we get a vaccine for COVID-19, this will be the first time we have ever developed a vaccine for a human coronavirus. The chances of that happening by the end of 2020 are slim to none. Even if we get one by then, the trials that it will have to go through, that in itself will take months, if not years. I don't know the full process of
and even if we do get a vaccine, A, we won't know the long-term consequences of it, and B, it's very likely that it could end up being like the flu and have lots of different mutations.
Right. And also, C, you have another thing coming if you think you will force me to get a vaccine.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. I'm not inherently a vaccine denier, but I do believe that good ideas don't require force.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Peyton, did you have anything else? Because I only have one more question for him.
Yeah, I do. What do you think? So we were talking about kind of like how this could have a political tint with the lockdowns. I would like to highlight something big, that the rhetoric has completely changed. From the beginning, it was all about flatten the curve, because, we do have a problem in this country where we have a smaller hospital capacity than we do have people in the country. So, hospitals could easily be overrun, especially in more rural areas, or even some urban areas where there's underfunding and there aren't enough hospitals for people. So, but now the rhetoric is lockdown till there's a vaccine, or just lockdown till whenever point. It's not really clear with a lot of these people, and a lot of people with lockdowns. I don't even think California has a standard for when it will open up. And it's still like in full lockdown. New York has somewhat of a standard, but it's kind of not. It's kind of being wary and changing and moving the goalposts for that for several counties. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that, since you're having a lot of experience with fighting these lockdowns and doing a lot of research on them.
Yeah, and you actually just hit one of the most important things to this. I can't believe I haven't brought it up until now. The concept of propaganda is something that I studied very deeply in my undergraduate studies. My senior seminar work was on propaganda within the military-industrial complex, actually. But what it really comes down to of these constant shifting standards is it's a test of what will the people put up with. And it really is a matter of propaganda, because the thing is that people almost get upset whenever they see facts that show that, okay, we have officially flattened the curve, and not only have we flattened the curve, but this virus isn't as bad as we originally thought it was. Both of those things are pieces of good news. right? So why is it that people are so fundamentally at this point? Well, it's because of the herd psychology that we've gotten into this, to where it's almost as though people, for the first time since 9/11, have something that's bringing them all together under a common cause. And who knew that this common cause would simply be do nothing as the government destroys society? Who would have thought that the greatest act of rebellion against the propagandists nowadays would be to live your life and be a productive member of society? I mean, that's my initial thoughts on it, is that it's just the goal of like, what are we going to do in order to ensure that the people truly are under our thumb? So we're going to give the standard to flatten the curve. And one of the things in regards to hospital capacity, whose fault is that? As far as I'm concerned, it's the fault of the politicians that have defended certificate of need licensing within our hospital systems, where we can't build a hospital without government permission, even if we're following every regulation that exists in the law books, which some of them are even nonsensical. But that's the whole thing, is that a lot of these governors are gaining popularity through these shutdowns, and a lot of these politicians understand that it's destroying the economy that Trump and the Republican Party are going to be relying upon when it comes time for the November election. So it's 100% political at this point. This whole thing of like, we need to flatten the curve. Okay, you guys have beaten us in the head with that. I guarantee you Karen doesn't know anything about immunology or about epidemiology beyond the phrase flatten the curve. But now we're saying we have to have a vaccine, or we have to make sure that there are no new cases, all of these things. It's just an excuse. It's a faux pas. That's the fact of what they're really trying to do, which is they're trying to disintegrate civilization. They're trying to disintegrate the faith. They're trying to disintegrate the family. They're trying to disintegrate the community. Why? Because all three of those things are entities that oppose the state, right? So that's my big take on it, is that their goal isn't necessarily to help anyone. Their goal is simply to embolden their own power.
That's an interesting take. I mean, it would make sense given that their popularity is rising.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big thing with it, is like, I don't know how Cuomo's doing popularity-wise, but I know that nationally he's a hero. I don't know, within the state, I don't know how that is, but I know within Kentucky, Andy Beshear has an 80% approval rating, and there's this weird fetishist community around him where these guys just literally have the quotation "govern me, daddy" in reference to Andy Beshear. And
that's really creepy. Odd. That's odd.
Yeah, right. It's creepy, and that's the whole thing that's exactly what I mean, to where what happens whenever you have a society that has no church, that is filled with people, that has no family connections, nor do they have any real community connections beyond some small friend networks. Well, another overarching monolithic entity is going to come in and try to fill the hole that has been left in the public's heart. I'm not trying to say that everyone should believe in God. I'm not trying to say that if you're an atheist, you're wrong. But we can clearly see that there's some very clear benefits to a faith-based society. In particular, one of those benefits is the fact that people have a central cornerstone to come around, to center upon. And that's one of the things that we've lost in these times. And because of this, government has this innate ability to fill and become that cornerstone. For more information on that, check out the book The Quest for Community by Robert Nisbet.
Okay. All right. I totally see what you're saying, that religion unifies people. My last question for you, and then Peyton can ask whatever questions he wants, or we can go right into our outro. You've made a name for yourself, not just in your state, but nationally even. Do you have any plans or any desire whatsoever to make something of it, whether it's keep fighting for liberty in some way, run for office? Do you have any ambitions, any desire whatsoever to continue that, to use your name and make something of it?
I mean, God has blessed me in the context of all I had to do to make this name for myself was sue the governor so that way I could continue to worship my God in person at churches. And that's something that I'm not going to disregard. And quite frankly, there's a burden upon me to put that to good use. I'm not going to commit to running for office, but I'm definitely going to say that I am going to fight for freedom. I've been working on several campaigns for people who do love freedom that are running for office. In addition to that, I'm also taking steps to gain a law degree so that way I can continue to practice law and defend the fundamental rights of people who have had their rights violated in the way that I have. Because that's the thing, is that for every story that you have of someone who did stand up, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people who haven't been able to stand up because they don't have a voice that's able to stand for them. And that's one of the things, is that people who have gained a notoriety, the thing that I hate is whenever people will take that name that they've made for themselves and use it to embolden themselves. This is the time to empower others who simply don't feel as though there's a way out of this.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that you have many options moving forward, and you're not just going to use it for the betterment of yourself, but you're going to find some way to help people going forward. So that makes me really happy to hear.
Thank you.
Peyton, any final questions?
No, I don't have any questions. I just want to thank you for, being on.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we can move right into some closing statements then, if we want to. TJ, if there's anything you want to really sell to the audience right now, if there's anything you really want them to know, now is the time.
Sure. Your rights still matter. We're dealing with a public health crisis. No one can deny that. But the fact of the matter is that doesn't mean that your liberties don't matter. It's as simple as standing up and just pointing out the injustices that you see within this system. It's not going to be popular. As I stated early on in the interview, you're going to face pushback. You're going to get threatened. But whenever they're threatening you, that means what you're doing is working. It means that you're dismantling this system that is destroying fundamental rights. So keep going, smile, and rejoice at the fact that they're going after you. Just keep up the fight at this point, because right now our liberty matters more now than ever.
That's very well said, and I'm sure our viewers will appreciate that message and take it to heart. Well, in terms of final statements, I don't really have all that much to say. I mean, this is something that's happening all across our country, obviously, but not every state is the same. There's no federal restrictions. There's federal guidelines, but so in terms of closing statements, I don't really have much to say other than just thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today about this. I wasn't aware of a lot of the things that were happening in Kentucky, and it's really eye-opening, and it honestly does give me hope, actually. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and all I have to say is, I have to agree with TJ that these are political moves. These are not about protecting people. I think from day one, this has been a grab for power, grab for improved approval ratings, and a way to, scare the public into surrendering more liberties. And as well, it's been a very useful distraction for the government. I mean, they've been able to reauthorize FISA warrants, reauthorize the Patriot Act, do record spending.
It's been so good for banks, so good.
Oh yeah. It's and record funding for all kinds of pork. Like what went to the Kennedy Center so they could get renovated during the coronavirus. I wonder how they're going to social distance, while they're re-renovating the Kennedy Center. And I've seen some of the research that TJ is talking about. And, there's more and more reports coming out that the deadliness of this virus has been overhyped, that it's not as bad as people were first saying, and that the lockdowns have been pretty unnecessary and largely counterintuitive. So, I got to agree with TJ with that on that, and I'm glad that he's been suing Andy Bashar, for attacking our, attacking rights in Kentucky. And, I'm glad that we had you on, TJ.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Godspeed, fellow warrior of liberty. Thank you for joining us on our podcast today, and that will conclude today's episode.